Good day, everyone. My name is Onisha Herring. I am Senior Vice President and Counsel at the National Fair Housing Alliance. The National Fair Housing Alliance, pronounced NAFA, is the country's only national civil rights organization dedicated solely to eliminating all forms of housing and lending discrimination and ensuring equitable housing opportunities for all people and communities. For over 30 years, NAFA has led the fair housing movement through its education and outreach, member services, public policy, advocacy, housing and community development, responsible AI enforcement, and consulting and compliance programs. The Washington State Covenant Homeownership Act study has been one of NAFA's most thrilling consulting projects, and we're extremely excited about what's taking place here in the great state of Washington. NAFA and the team that we've put together are committed to supporting effective special purpose credit programs like this one, and are honored to be a part of this effort alongside the commission and all of you here. Our team has been immersed for about the last 8 months in a process to fulfill the requirements around the development of this study as set out in the Covenant Homeownership Act. This broad team includes NAFA as lead consultant, Act Global, a research and consulting firm with deep expertise in publicly administered homeownership programs, data analysis, and fair housing, and the Northwest Fair Housing Alliance and the Fair Housing Center of Washington, 2 local groups with years of knowledge and expertise in fighting housing discrimination in the state of Washington. We've also partnered with James Gregory and Arthur Acklin, professors at the University of Washington, who served as our expert reviewers. And finally, we worked with the Urban Institute, a nonprofit research organization that provided some of the data in the study. Next slide, please. So first, let me take a step back and provide a brief overview of how we got here. In spring of 2023, the Washington State Legislature passed the Covenant Homeownership Act. The Covenant Homeownership Act acknowledges the state's role in creating barriers to credit and home ownership for historically marginalized communities in Washington, and that these discriminatory actions continue to impact these communities today. This landmark legislation made Washington State a pioneer and an example for other states on effective ways to remediate past housing discrimination and promote equity and fairness. Washington State should be extremely proud of these efforts. Today, we will walk through the elements of the Covenant Homeownership Program study, legal framework and other considerations, modeling results, recommendations that came out of the study, program implementation timeline, and then we'll also have time for questions and answers. You can also use the question and answer icon at the bottom of your Zoom window, and we will be able to answer those questions in real time. Next slide, please. So just to remind everyone, the study we're discussing today was commissioned under the Covenant Homeownership Act, which lays the foundation for the homeownership program. It includes basic parameters for the program, including providing loans for down payment and closing cost assistance, requiring that participants repay loans at the time the house is sold. An eligible buyer must have a household income at or below 100% of the area median income, be a first-time home buyer, and be a resident of Washington, who was a resident before the enactment of the Federal Fair Housing Act on April 11th, 1968, or would have been excluded from home ownership in Washington State by a racially restrictive covenant on or before that day, or is a descendant of a resident that I just described. This study that we are talking about today stems from these legislative requirements. Next slide, please. So now to the study itself. So the task at hand was laid out to us in the request for proposals developed by the state. The completed study follows that structure by outlining key findings in 5 different chapters. Chapter 1 documents the past housing and lending discrimination in which the state was a passive and active actor. Chapter 2 analyzes the extent to which the impacts of discrimination still persist as evidenced in the data on Washington's racial and ethnic homeownership, credit access, and other housing stability gaps. Chapter 3 analyzes whether and the extent to which existing and race-neutral approaches are sufficient to remedy the past impacts of discrimination. Chapter 4 models various options for programmatic solutions that use race-conscious framework, race-conscious framework and recommends elements of a special purpose credit program. And then finally, Chapter 5 discusses approaches for evaluating the program and the monitoring that is continued to be needed. We are fortunate to have a team of experts who led the development of each study, share a high-level overview of each chapter, which we'll get into in a few seconds. Next slide, please. Overall, our approach to completing the study involved mixed methods. Our teams completed a literature review, reviewed dozens of articles, periodicals, historical records, conducted key informant interviews with professors and other experts, and reviewed census data and looked at other sources such as HMDA data, Zillow pricings data, and homelessness point-in-time counts, etc. We also relied on input from community members and several different stakeholders. So right now, I will turn it over to Marley Hawkendonner to speak about stakeholder engagement, and then they will pass it on to the team members who will talk about each chapter and so forth. Next slide, please.
Good morning. Thank you, Onisha. And I may be joined in a minute here by Adria Buchanan as well from the Fair Housing Center of Washington. The two fair housing agencies in Washington State, Northwest Fair Housing Alliance, and the Fair Housing Center of Washington, based in Tacoma, were both contracted as subcontractors on this project to assist with outreach to various stakeholders. The slide here interviews many of the activities that we engaged in. NAFA developed a website that was hosted, a web page devoted to this project, which was hosted on NAFA's website. There was a survey that was created and then widely circulated through email campaigns to over 4,000 email recipients, including nearly 500 organizations and over 23,000 separate emails. Social media posts were made, and there were many organizations and coalitions that then reposted and reshared the information about the study, primarily the link to the survey, driving people to the survey and offering to make presentations to groups upon request or conduct individual interviews with stakeholders. Additionally, we engaged in a PSA campaign in both English and Spanish on radio and print, and some of those outlets are listed on here as well. There were some listening sessions held. There was several interviews, primarily with subject matter experts and researchers, tabling events, presentations to over 300 people, site visits to over 30 sites in Washington, including Seattle, Spokane, Tri-City, Sunnyside, Granger, Yakima, Colville, and Western Washington. So we had a short timeline, but I think we did pretty good coverage over the whole state. Did you want to add anything, Adria?
No, I think that was a great overview. Thanks, Marley.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Marley and Adria. I'm Shanti Abedin. I'm the Vice President of Housing and Community Development at the National Fair Housing Alliance. And as Onisha mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about the first chapter in the study. So the charge for Chapter 1 was to document discrimination in housing in Washington's history, and specifically documenting the roles that the state played, whether that role was active or passive in discrimination in housing and the access of credit. And the Covenant Homeownership Act acknowledges this history and role pretty extensively in its text, but what this chapter does is it lays out chronologically, era by era, what was done in terms of the policies and practices that locked marginalized groups and people of color specifically out of ownership and wealth building opportunities for over a century. So we start the chapter with an overview of some of the pre-statehood actions by federal and territorial governments to seize land from the native populations living there and ensure that land ownership was really primarily for white settlers in Washington. But the exploration of the state's role begins specifically with the Washington Constitution when it was finalized in 1889. So we start with the pre-20th century, early 1900s. There were a lot of exclusionary practices and policies directed at all people of color, but Asians and Native Americans in particular at that time. That includes actions like the state's 1921 Alien Land Bill that restricted ownership of land and leasing by non-citizens, and an extensive amount of violence and intimidation against Asians and Native Americans in cities that at that time. It also includes the start of zoning, exclusionary zoning in particular, that started during this time period. So Seattle was the first city to develop a zoning plan in the state, and they did so with Harlan Bartholomew, who was an engineer behind the explicitly racist exclusionary zoning policies in St. Louis and other cities. And those types of activities solidified segregation in a number of Washington's cities. We also cover the start of the use of racially restrictive covenants, which are the namesake for this program. And were specific language inserted into the deeds of properties, prohibiting the sale and residence and passage of property to a variety of races, ethnicities, and religions. There are terms specifically referring to Black people, Pacific Islanders, Hindus, Asians, Jews, and Latinos in that language. We also specifically detail the state's role in recording deeds and plats for new subdivisions that had racist covenants in them, as well as the state's role in licensing agents who were playing an active role in enforcing these covenants and ensuring that these racist practices occur. We then cover the practice of redlining. We cover the role of the Federal Housing Administration and the New Deal era in shaping land and housing ownership. We talk about the creation of public housing in the 1930s and 40s, which includes the development of housing developments that had racial quotas. Then we talk about the World War II era, which brought new migration of Black and Latino groups in particular. We talk about the segregating policies that were in place in the Tri-Cities area, including Kennewick being maintained as a sundown town by police, and Black migrants coming to work at the Hanford site. We cover the Japanese internment and the GI Bill, and specifically how it benefited white veterans tremendously in terms of homeownership, but did not do the same for veterans of other races. This era also saw the migration of Native Americans and Latinos around the state because of the Bracero program and the Indian Relocation Act. We then cover the 1957 Urban Renewal Law, which displaced many people of color. And that activity continued through the 70s as highways were built, also displacing communities of color. We spend a good amount of time talking about the civil rights era and specifically highlight two cases that are examples of the Washington courts ruling against Black families who are attempting to purchase land or homes in segregated white areas. We continue the historic timeline through the 1970s, where we touch on redlining by banks and how state government played a role in sort of resisting accountability for banks that were redlining during that time. And then we conclude the chapter by covering the Growth Management Act, and forces that have exacerbated displacement, as well as the foreclosure crisis and continued exclusionary zoning policies. So it's a long chapter. It has a very long and deep history in it, and it includes throughout stories and quotes from individual experiences that were in periodicals and first-person interviews and things like that. And we also include an appendix of about 25 stories of discrimination with this chapter as well. I'm going to turn it over to Erin Kemple.
Thank you, Shanti. Again, my name is Erin Kemple. I'm the Vice President of Fair Housing Services at the National Fair Housing Alliance. I worked with NAFA's President and CEO, Lisa Rice, on Chapter 2. Chapter 2 addresses whether and to what extent the historical discriminatory practices that Shanti just outlined that were included in Chapter 1, whether those practices continue to impact homeownership today. Using both demographic data as well as anecdotal evidence, this chapter finds that the long-term impacts of historical discrimination includes persistent patterns of segregation. In fact, Washington State is far more segregated than most areas in the United States, with people of color concentrated in the urban areas of Seattle, Tacoma, and Spokane, and the balance of the state, the majority of people there are white. There are also disparities in wealth and home ownership rates. In fact, home ownership rates for people who are Black has been in decline at least since 1970. Wealth looks at the amount of assets that people have. This includes both their value of their home as well as values of businesses, stocks, and other retirement. Wealth for Blacks has also not grown as quickly as wealth for other groups. And that is also true for people who are Latino. There's inequitable access to credit and mortgage lending, with people of color, particularly people who are Black and Latino, not having access to credit and mortgage lending at the same rates as people who are white. And finally, there are other discriminatory effects of those historic discriminatory actions. They include disparities in homelessness, access to safe and secure housing, as well as greater cost burdens for people who are Black or Latino and some Asian groups than for people who are white. As you can see from the chart on the right of your screen, it shows that people who are white have the highest home ownership rates in the state, followed by people who are Asian. From there, people who are Indian and Alaskan Natives have the third highest home ownership rate, with Latinos, Blacks, and finally Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander groups falling in the lowest home ownership categories in the state. This chapter also did further research into the subgroups that are included in the broad category of Asians. That research reveals that while this group, Asians, has largely rebounded from the discriminatory actions described in Chapter 1, and now has a home ownership rate that is comparable to people who are white, people who are Korean and Asian Indians experience substantially lower home ownership rates compared to whites and Asians as a whole. As a result of that, and moving on to Chapter 3, this report focuses on the home ownership needs of people who are Black, Latino, Korean, Asian Indian, as well as people who are American Indian and Alaskan Natives and Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander groups. Passing it over to Chapter 3, Sarah. Next slide.
I'm Sarah Wolf. I'm a senior associate at APT. APT worked on chapters 3, 4, and 5 of the study, and I'll be talking through those chapters now. Chapter 3 looks at existing programs and race-neutral approaches and compares them with a race-conscious approach. We examine how these different forms of assistance could remedy the discrimination described in the earlier chapters. We first inventoried existing programs in Washington that support home buyers, most of which provide down payment assistance. For the largest programs, we looked at who received assistance in recent years and compared their characteristics to the characteristics of impacted residents, that group that Erin just described. We found that the existing programs primarily use race-neutral approaches and primarily aid non-impacted residents. We also modeled and compared the likely outcomes of 3 different approaches to assisting households that use both race-neutral and race-conscious eligibility criteria. We found that DPA assistance was the most effective of the supports that we modeled. We also modeled an interest rate reduction and a credit improvement approach. DPA assisted the greatest number of impacted residents of these options. We also found that a race-conscious eligibility approach would be the most effective for reaching impacted residents. Assuming a constant funding level, the modeled race-neutral down payment assistance program would reach roughly 1/4 the number of impacted residents compared with a race-conscious approach. We estimated that the cost to reach all impacted residents using a race-neutral approach would be about $6 billion, and it would take decades to serve them all based on the expected revenue from the Covenant Homeownership Fund, which is expected to be closer to $75 to $100 million per year. Next slide. Chapter 2 evaluates and recommends potential Chapter 4 evaluates and recommends potential programmatic and policy changes, including the creation of a special purpose credit program. Like in Chapter 3, we assess how the various options for a special purpose credit program could remedy the impacts of the discrimination identified in Chapter 1 on the currently impacted residents identified in Chapter 2. We extended the policy simulations that we did in Chapter 3 by examining a range of options for structuring a special purpose credit program to determine which option or options would be most effective at achieving the objectives outlined in the Act. We find that a customized approach to providing DPA, where the amount of assistance is based on the applicant's income and location, is the most effective and efficient approach. I'll be discussing the modeling approach and results in a lot more detail a little bit later in the presentation. Another notable finding from Chapter 4 is that a large number of impacted residents with incomes between 100 and 140% of AMI could be assisted. However, the Covenant Homeownership Act restricts funds to just those with incomes at or below 100% of area median income. Finally, Chapter 4 also includes a discussion of administrative challenges that the Commission will need to consider in implementing the program, and a discussion of other complementary policies that may be needed to actually close the racial homeownership gap in Washington State. For example, efforts to increase the supply of entry-level homes. Okay, Chapter 5, next slide. Chapter 5 discusses possible approaches to evaluating the Covenant Homeownership Program over time. We describe multiple evaluation approaches and present a logic model for the program. It also suggests 2 potential targets that could be used to monitor the continuing need for the program. The first is a target based on the volume of applications the Commission receives for the program. If the Commission does not receive any applications, that may justify ending the program. Second is a target based on the size of the reduction in the racial homeownership gap in the state. If the homeownership gap attributable to state action is eliminated, that may also justify ending the program. I'll now pass things over to Morgan to talk through a few important legal considerations.
Thank you, Sarah. Next slide, please. Hello, again, I'm Morgan Williams, General Counsel with the National Fair Housing Alliance. It has really been a pleasure to work with the Commission and many of you on this effort. And I want to acknowledge the tremendous legal resources that Faith Pettis and her colleagues at Pacifica Law Group provide to the Commission. I'm going to say a word about the legal framework for special purpose credit programs. Congress authorized special purpose credit programs, or SPCPs, in the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, or ECOA, as a tool to counteract centuries of unfair laws and policies that deprived millions of consumers the right and opportunity to access fair mortgages and credit. SPCPs are targeted lending products designed specifically to help an economically disadvantaged group who, under customary standards of credit worthiness, probably would not receive credit or would receive it on less favorable terms than are ordinarily available to other consumers applying for similar types and amounts of credit. Congress ensured that these programs serving an economically disadvantaged group may consider race or ethnicity without violating ECOA's prohibition on discrimination in order to increase access to the credit market by persons previously foreclosed from it. In their design and implementation, SPCPs remediate the present-day impacts of historic and ongoing discrimination in the credit market. This study provides the basis for developing Washington's Covenant Homeownership Program as an SPCP. In the study recommendation section, which we will discuss further in our remarks today, we'll outline that the Commission and state legislature may consider a broader aperture in implementing programs that might meet a wider need, including involving households that may be over 100% area median income per the data referenced in Sarah's prior remarks, those that may have been impacted by state discrimination since 1968, and other subgroups that may be identified with further study. Ultimately, this study proposes a data-based analysis and set of recommendations. Accordingly, I'll now turn it back over to Sarah to brief you on the study model analysis considerations.
Thanks so much, Morgan. As I mentioned before, our recommendations for the program are based in part on the results of models that we created to help assess different potential program options. So now I'm going to spend a bit of time going through those models in more detail. First, as we approached the models, we identified goals for the Covenant Homeownership Program based on the Act. These goals included to ensure that eligible households receive a large enough down payment to afford to purchase a home of decent quality. Second, that the program serve as many eligible households as feasible, and that the program not advantage any particular race or ethnic group among the group of eligible households. To ensure that the Covenant Homeownership Program does not further the patterns of residential segregation that Aaron described earlier, we wanted to assess how various programs work in different parts of the state. So we looked at how the different options provided homebuyers with a reasonable choice of homes, and how well different options worked in high-cost counties as well as other parts of the state. Next slide, please. We modeled how much down payment assistance would be needed to enable economically disadvantaged households to afford to purchase a home. These models assume that home buyers have a first mortgage that is like an FHA mortgage. We use some assumptions for the mortgage amount that are based on income, savings, and creditworthiness. The models all use data about renters from the American Community Survey. As we described before, the Covenant Homeownership Act specifies eligible households. However, data limitations make it difficult to identify those who meet all of the criteria in the Act, particularly the pre-1968 residency requirement. So our models focus on the characteristics of all impacted residents. The Covenant Homeownership Act also limits eligibility to those with 100% of area median income or below. But many impacted residents with higher incomes could also benefit. So our models examine two populations, 80 to 100% of AMI and 100 to 140% of AMI. Next slide, please. As you probably know, housing prices are highly variable across the state of Washington, and this complicates the process of determining how much assistance the program should provide. Amounts that work in low-cost areas are not sufficient in high-cost areas, which affects who can benefit from the program. To compare the models against the program goals that I talked about earlier, we calculated 3 metrics for each of the options. First is the average amount of assistance that would be provided. That is for all the eligible households, what is the average amount that people would need to receive? Second, the number of households that could be served with $100 million. This is roughly estimating the amount of funds that will be available in the Covenant Homeownership Fund, so you can get a sense of how many people can practically be served. And the third metric is called the attainability percentage. This is a measure of how much of a county or end of the state would be accessible to borrowers based on how much assistance they are receiving and the prices for homes in those areas. We modeled multiple fixed down payment assistance amounts from $25,000 to $100,000 and multiple approaches to providing customized down payment amounts, which cap the amount of assistance at different amounts based on local housing prices. Next slide, please. Of the options, a customized amount of down payment assistance based on income and location best met the program goals. 2 of the customized models in particular, one that capped the amount of assistance at the cost of a mid-level home in the county, and the other that capped the amount at a level sufficient to afford a modest cost home in at least half of the county, rose to the top. You can see results for those 2 options here. Option 4 would be slightly higher cost than option 5, but would provide a greater choice of homes throughout the state and in high-cost counties. You can see that by the higher attainability percentage, the right 2 most columns. The furthest right column shows the attainability percentage for just high-cost counties, and the column just to the left is the attainability percentage throughout the entire state. And you can see the attainability percentages in the 90s for option 4 are higher than in the 60s for option 5. However, in both of these cases, home buyers will receive enough assistance to enable those with incomes between 80% and 100% of area median income to purchase a home in the county where they live. These estimates assume that on average, households purchase a modest cost home, which is around the 20th percentile of sales. The commission will need to decide on the final price to use, and we recommend some ground truthing against real sales as they make that decision. Finally, as I said before, we also modeled the cost for households with higher incomes, those with incomes between 100 and 140% of area median income. These folks need less assistance, so the average GPA needed to serve them is lower, which would allow the state to help more home buyers. However, the Act does not currently allow applicants with incomes over 100% of area median income to be eligible for assistance. Next slide. We thought it might be helpful to see an example of how the customized approach would work. So this option you see here assumes an eligible household is looking to buy a home in Renton. So first they need to know what the subsidy standard is. Let's assume it's $506,000, meaning that the Covenant Homeownership Program would help a household purchase a home up to that price. Next, they need to determine what amount of first mortgage they could afford. Let's assume that this family can afford a mortgage of $385,000. The amount of down payment assistance is the difference between the subsidy standard of $506,000 and the amount the family can afford, $385,000. So in that case, the amount of assistance is $121,000. There are still details for the commission to work out in implementing a customized DPA program. That includes a specific percentile to use when setting the subsidy standard, and if the standard should be different for single family homes or condos. I'm going to pass it back over to Morgan, who will talk through the specific recommendations we make for the Covenant Homeownership Program.
Thank you, Sarah. This is a lot of information to present in, a short period of time, but fortunately we're detailing an overview of information that's in the report. So you can dig into further detail on all of this, including our model analysis considerations there. The Covenant Homeownership legislation called for the study to include recommendations. And so we have detailed 5, both for a programmatic implementation within the contours of the existing statute and for implementation considerations beyond the contours of the existing statute. The first recommendation we detail is that the commission implement the SPCP as outlined in the Covenant statute for households and groups experiencing disparities in need of remediation. The Covenant Homeownership Act authorizes the commission to create an SPCP that provides down payment and closing cost assistance in the form of a loan repayable at the time the home is sold, who have a household income below 100% AMI, are first-time home buyers, and are Washington residents who meet the eligibility requirements related to residency in the state before enactment of the Federal Fair Housing Act in 1968. As we noted, as Aaron, specifically noted in our review of Chapter 2, the results presented in this study demonstrate that there is a substantial need for such a program for impacted residents, which, based on the data we have noted, includes heads of households who are Black, Latino, Native American, Alaskan Native, Korean, Asian, Indian, Native Hawaiian, or other Pacific Islanders in Washington state. In short, we recommend a program within the legislative guardrails for the identified impacted residents. Secondly, as Sarah noted in giving an overview of our modeling approach, we recommend that the commission provide assistance sufficient to enable households to afford a modest cost home in their county. The commission has many options for setting the amount of down payment assistance it makes available through the SPCP. The study recommends a customized approach to provide this down payment assistance to these impacted residents in the amount of assistance that they need, depending upon their income and location. Third, we recommend expanding eligibility to impacted residents with incomes up to 140% of area median income. The analysis demonstrates that impacted residents with incomes between 100 and 140% area median income could also benefit from down payment assistance. Many renters in this income category face the same challenges as lower income renters affording the cost of even a modest cost home in their county, and would be regarded as economically disadvantaged in any efforts to secure credit in credit markets across the state. Next slide, please. Fourth, excuse me, I guess we're still on the prior slide. I'm jumping ahead here. But fourth, we recommend providing down payment assistance as a zero interest loan and consider repayment flexibility. Many down payment assistance programs, including those currently administered by the commission, are structured down payment assistance programs as a no interest rate loan to balance the goals of helping individuals and maximizing the number of eligible households. The study recommends that the commission should structure down payment assistance as a zero interest loan repayable at the time of sale. Next slide, please. As I noted, there's certain considerations around expanding AMI and considering allowing households to reuse some or all of their assistance to apply to the purchase of a subsequent home. Additionally, and finally, the study recommends considering further study to identify and serve other impacted residents. A future study could consider the documentary basis for and practical issues expanding eligibility, including how to design and implement objective and workable criteria to determine whether a particular household that was subject to unlawful discrimination by the state and is economically disadvantaged, even though that household does not meet eligibility requirements of the SPCP that will be established by the Commission under the Covenant Homeownership Act, such as a household impacted by state discrimination and action since 1968. The Commission, under the legislation, will receive this study and these recommendations and make series of determinations about a program to proceed with. And it is with that that I turn it over to our colleagues at the Commission, to Lisa, to discuss next steps. Again, it has been a pleasure to work with everyone on the presentation.
And good morning, everyone. My name is Lisa DeBrock. I'm the Director of the Homeownership Division at the Washington State Housing Finance Commission. And thank you so much for joining us this morning and for your interest in the study and the program. And of course, a big shout out to NAFA and team for all the heavy lifting and all the hard work you've done to this point to get us here. So officially, what's next? That's the big question. And the study was due to the legislature on March 22nd, so that has been submitted. And NAFA completed a presentation to our Board of Commissioners at our meeting last week on March 28th. And we are holding our public webinar for questions today. But the commission staff, or actually I should say, the baton has officially now been given to the commission as we look to stand up a very exciting program before July as per the legislation. And so our staff will be very, very busy in the next few months. So by April 15th, we will be putting out an invitation to hold a listening session on the program. Of course, this will all be based upon the Covenant Homeownership Act and the recommendations that are in this study. And we intend to bring a program to our commission meeting on April 25th for a public hearing. And then we will be very, very busy over the next few months training our lenders, getting information out on the programs, updating our website, and doing all the necessary steps to implement a program. Per the legislation, everything does need to be up and running by July 1st, and we will be there. So there's no vacations for commission staff. We're again going to be here to answer all of your questions and get your input. And with that, I will turn it back over, I believe, Onisha, to you for questions.
Sure. Thank you so much, Lisa. Again, we are truly excited about what's happening in Washington State, and we're here to answer any questions about the study itself. I do have one question that I think we can answer live. It's from Thea Lacrosse. And it says, as an affordable home ownership nonprofit, a community land trust, they seek guidance on how we may consider race and ethnicity to support potential candidates for homes that we offered. As mentioned in the discussion at the start of the SPCP program, I'm wondering if Morgan or Shanti want to address this question.
And so I'm just trying to make sure I understand. Hello again, everyone. This is Morgan Williams. I'm trying to make sure it may consider in support of potential candidates for homes we may offer. So the question here is, I'm just trying to understand is who would be implementing the program as mentioned in the discussion. So I'd say a couple of words broadly about special purpose credit programs in response to this question. Special purpose credit programs, again, are detailed under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act as housing programs that can meet the needs of economically disadvantaged groups or others who are not able to access current credit in current markets, and historically disadvantaged groups. And so there's been a great prevalence among, in particular, private banks and other credit providers in engaging in instituting special purpose credit programs in recent years. The National Fair Housing Alliance has produced a toolkit that's focused on private entities in partnership with the Mortgage Bankers Association, and we can put a link that's available for information about that. The question specifically here was, I think, to nonprofits. And there's information on specific guidance on that toolkit that is tailored towards nonprofits that are interested in instituting special purpose credit program or partnering with credit providers in regards to their special purpose credit programs. And so would definitely reference that toolkit. And there are slightly different kind of regulatory guidance that's provided to for-profit entities, as in contrast to nonprofit and public entities such as the state here. And that, that's detailed in the toolkit, but happy to provide more information otherwise down offline.
Thanks so much, Morgan. We have one other question that I think is appropriate for us to answer live. How would the residency status affect the qualifications of the program? And this is from Marianne Nichols.
Hi, and this is Lisa. I think I have that question. I mean, the program is meant to work in concert with commission programs. So at the end of the day, the borrower does need to qualify for a loan based upon FHA, VA, USDA, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac guidelines. We do sell and pool all of our loans. We are not a portfolio lender. So whatever those guidelines are would still flow with the program. And I hope that answers your question, Marianne. If not, you know where to find me. So I hope that you'll reach out. Thank you.
Thanks so much. We have one other question that Shanti will go over and respond to.
Sure. So there is a question about that says that we mentioned that Jewish Washingtonians were impacted by racially restrictive covenants and other forms of housing discrimination, and then acknowledge that the data does not disaggregate for this group. So the question is specifically if we research that further and why the decision was made not to err on the side of providing access to the program for Jewish Washingtonians. And so I will just note that we did extensive research to really document the discrimination that occurred against Jewish residents, as you've noted. So inclusion in racially restrictive covenants, reviewed interviews, and firsthand accounts of that discrimination. Because the data, US Census data, American Community Survey data, HMDA data, and other data that we referenced for the analysis of lingering impacts in the state today on present day populations doesn't disaggregate for Jewish residents. It was difficult for us, or not possible for us to include them in the recommendations as a group to include. This is because to form a special purpose credit program, there is a requirement that the present day data show disparities that are in need of remedial action that is taken by the special purpose credit program. So if there isn't present day data that shows that there is a gap or disparity that needs to be remedied through this program, it is not able to really be qualified for a special purpose credit. That group isn't really able to be qualified for a special purpose credit program. So because that data wasn't available, we did not include them in the recommended groups to be eligible for a special purpose credit program. However, we did say that further study could be done in this area, and that it would be recommended that further analysis could be done for groups that didn't qualify because of the lack of data on that specific subset.
Thanks so much, Shanti. We have about 25 minutes left. So if there are any other questions, please put it in the question and answer box now. I'll wait about 1 minute to see if we receive any additional questions. Well, hearing none, I just want to take a second to applaud this phenomenal team that was led by Shanti Abedin, who graciously shepherded us through this process, 8-month-long process, and commend Washington State again for your robust efforts to shore up special purpose credit programs in your state, but more importantly, to level the playing field so that everyone has an equitable access to housing and homeownership in your state, particularly considering the past harm that was documented in the study. So thank you so much for this time. Oh, I actually see 2 questions now. That's wonderful. Yay. All right. So we have a question about credit improvement versus down payment assistance. Does anyone want to speak more broadly about those 2 aspects?
Yeah,
Shanti.
I can talk about those.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
In chapter 3, we looked at multiple different types of assistance that could be provided to assist home buyers. That included down payment assistance as well as a modeled credit improvement program. We found that the down payment assistance was the most effective of the different types of assistance that could be provided. And the sort of foundational reason for that is that not having the sufficient down payment assistance and not being able to provide or to afford the monthly mortgage on a modest cost home in the county in much of Washington State due to the high home prices, combination of high home prices and low income, sort of meant that that was the biggest hurdle. The credit constraint wasn't as significant as a hurdle for most impacted residents compared with the down payment hurdle. So that's why we concluded that the down payment assistance would be the most effective means of supporting impacted residents to become home buyers rather than programs that would support credit improvement. So hopefully that answers the question. I'll say there's a lot of more detail in the study, and there's some tables that are related to chapter 3 that show the likely impact of the different types of assistance. So you might want to look at those tables, particularly for the credit improvement models.
Thanks so much, Sarah. If you have any additional questions, now is the time to pose them in the chat box. We do have 2 additional questions. One is, have you included guidance to help disparities in lending and banking institutions policies? My understanding is that this study focuses on Washington State, not lenders more broadly or at risk. However, if anyone else wants to chime in on this particular question, please feel free to do so.
This is Morgan. I would just say, Onisha, that's right. And I would only add that, the same liabilities that exist, otherwise under the Fair Housing Act regarding any service provider in the housing or credit market, would continue to apply, such that if there were discriminatory policies that those institutions are implementing or redlining practices, they would be subject to scrutiny and, from, private litigants or from the Department of Justice who maintains a robust docket to this day on modern day redlining activity. So this study does not deal with those practices that would otherwise remain subject to fair housing and other civil rights statute liability.
Thanks so much, Morgan. We have another question from Ms. Daniels, who wants to know whether this program assists with major home repairs, such as replacements of septic tanks. I suspect the answer to that is, oh, go ahead, Lisa.
So the answer, per the legislation, it is for down payment and closing costs at this point. So I don't believe that would be covered.
Thanks so much. Yes, that's my understanding as well, Lisa. We were constrained by the legislative statutory language, which is what Lisa just stated. So no, it does not include home improvement loans. Donna has a question about whether there's been any thought to provide education, post-purchase, or homeowner counseling. I will defer to Lisa on that as well. That's outside the scope of the study that we were conducting.
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. Absolutely. We are huge proponents of housing counseling at the commission. So we are looking at ways to best incorporate counseling pre and post and make sure that the families who need post-purchase counseling, as per the question, get what they, we want people, we want to make, not only do we want families to purchase homes, we want them to stay in their homes. So, we're working out those mechanics and definitely interested in any ideas that you may have. Again, feel free to reach out. I'd love to hear more.
Thanks, Lisa. We have another question about data, and I'll post this for Shanti. Does your data support continued discriminatory market impacts post 1968?
I'm not entirely clear on the question. I think that the data in this study supports or shows that there's continued impact from discriminatory actions pre-1968 across the state. That was really the charge for the study, that we look at those lingering impacts, from historic discrimination and discrimination that occurred, prior to the passage of the Fair Housing Act. However, we did look at discrimination data in the state, housing discrimination data in the state from a few different sources, including our members who are here on the call, and data from various enforcement agencies. And, there of course is continued housing discrimination occurring in the state. And so, that's not explicitly covered in the study because of the narrow scope of the study, but that was looked at as part of our analysis as well.
Thank you, Shanti. Again, you have us until 2:15 Eastern time, or Pacific time, 11:15 Pacific, 2:15 Eastern. So if there are any questions, now is the time. If not, we will close. All right, seeing no questions in the chat at this juncture, we thank you for your time in attending this presentation today. We commend you for all the efforts in Washington State and look forward to working with you all going forward. Thank you again for attending, and we will talk to you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you.